I remember that evening as one remembers a half-forgotten line of verse, beautiful, slightly out of reach, and carrying a sadness one cannot quite name. Oxford had folded itself into that curious hour between rain and darkness, when the bells seemed to ring more gently, as if unwilling to disturb the damp air. I had gone to Christ Church, not for religion. I've never been guilty of that indulgence, but for the choir. There is something about the sound of boys' voices, dissolving against stone, that reminds me that the world, though irredeemably foolish, still retains a fragment of grace. I sat near the back, where the shadows seemed friendlier, and watched the procession glide past like a moving fresco. I noted, as I always do, the small imperfections, a chorister slightly offbeat, the dean's threadbare sleeve, the hesitant lighting of a candle. These details comfort me. Perfection has never been trustworthy. When they began O Nata Lux, the air itself appeared to still. The organ's low hum reached my chest like the pulse of a forgotten dream. And for a few suspended seconds, I believed that the ugliness of the day, the paperwork, the petty bickering, the tiresome phone call from Strange about budgetary constraints might dissolve under the weight of a simple harmony. It didn't, of course, but the illusion was exquisite while it lasted. Outside, the rain had returned, brushing the cobblestones with an almost apologetic persistence. Lewis waited by the gate, shifting from one foot to the other, his expression hovering somewhere between patience and pity. He said something about a body found by the river near Magdalen Bridge. A don, apparently. Drowned. I remember replying that Oxford has always had a fondness for water, and an even greater one for despair. He frowned at what the good man always does when poetry dares intrude upon procedure, and I followed him through the cloisters, where the lamps flickered like thoughts one tries to extinguish. I could smell wet stone, damp paper, and the faint ghost of candle wax clinging to my coat. Somewhere behind us, the choir had moved to the final verse. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. At the towpath, the world seemed smaller. A cluster of constables stood huddled under umbrellas, their murmurs rising and falling like the tide itself. The body had already been taken away, a relief, though I never admitted. The river was swollen, full of invisible movements. I watched it slide past, dark and indifferent, and thought of the strange democracy of drowning scholar or drunkard. The water makes no distinction. Lewis recited the essential male, late 40s, found at dawn, no sign of violence. A cyclist had reported the bicycle left upright near the bank. I asked what the man had been wearing. A blue tie, sir, he said. The college color. St. Cuthbert's. That name stirred a dim recollection of a small, cloistered college, heavy with the scent of ivy and tradition. I had attended one of their lectures once, years ago, and recalled a man quoting Sophocles badly. I mentioned it to Lewis, half to myself, half to the rain. He looked puzzled, as he often does when my thoughts take their usual detours. We stood there a while longer, both of us pretending that the silence was useful. Across the river, the lamps of Magdalen glimmered faintly, as though seen through tears one hadn't yet admitted to shedding. Somewhere a bicycle bell rang small, incongruous, almost cheerful. I found myself wondering whether the drowned man had heard it too, in that last moment before surrender. Later, back in my flat, I poured a modest whiskey, more ritual than solace, and unfolded the evening edition. The headline was a brief and self-satisfied college fellow found dead in Cherwell. Below it, a photograph of a face I vaguely remember, narrow, thoughtful, the sort of man who might correct your Latin while envying your ignorance. I traced the black and white contours with my thumb, Dr. Alan Merriweather. Yes, I had seen him once in a guest lecture on Euripides, where he'd argued that irony was the last refuge of the disillusioned. I liked that. The paper, however, offered no irony, only facts stripped of their humanity, as though a man's death were merely an administrative inconvenience. The accompanying paragraph declared it an accidental drowning. I read that line twice, not because I doubted it, but because something about it refused to settle. Outside, the rain began again harder this time, as if the city were attempting to cleanse itself of all that had been forgotten. I closed the paper and turned off the lamp. The room grew quiet, filled only by the faint ticking of a clock that kept perfect, merciless time. And in that darkness, I thought of the blue tie, the misquoted Sophocles, and the calm of evensong. Some part of me, the foolish, persistent part, already knew this was no accident at all. It was Lewis who said, as we stood outside the mortuary, that he never understood why academics seemed to die so tidily. I think he meant that they looked as if they had prepared their deaths with the same care they gave to their lectures. Dr. Allen Merriweather was no exception. Even in death, the man had a kind of deliberate stillness, the sort that only comes from years of solitude and study. The attendant pulled back the sheet with a bureaucrat's indifference. The face beneath was narrower than I remembered, the eyes shut, but not at peace. I noticed at once the faint discoloration around the throat where the tie had pressed. It was blue, the particular shade used by St. Cuthbert's to mark its alumni. Someone had knotted it carefully, too carefully for chance. Lewis muttered something about the current, about how the river sometimes drags its victims downstream before surrendering them. I was only half listening. My attention was fixed on the knot of that tie. It was symmetrical, and the pattern faced outward, a detail only another person could have achieved. Later, in Merriweather's rooms, the air smelled of pipe tobacco and wet wool. A small electric heater hummed against the damp. Books lined the walls like solemn witnesses, Euripides, Sophocles, and a shelf of slim, unreadable poetry collections. On the desk lay a half-finished crossword torn from the Times. I read the clues, not out of curiosity, but habit. One caught my eye. River's secret poet lies below. The answer, I suspected, was more than metaphor. Lewis was busy with his notebook, recording details with the gentle clumsiness of a man still learning reverence. He said the deceased had been working late in college the night before, seen leaving just after midnight. No sign of forced entry. No note. The bursar had mentioned a quarrel earlier that week about publication rights for a joint paper. I asked whose name would have appeared first. He didn't know. Few people do, until it matters. The window looked out onto the quadrangle, a square of clipped grass bordered by the cloister's dim arches. The rain had begun again, turning the flagstones slick. A student hurried by with a folder clutched under his arm, his gown flapping like a black wing. For a moment, I envied him that obliviousness peculiar to youth when death still feels like theatre. I opened a drawer and found a packet of letters bound with fading blue ribbon. Most were drafts, corrections, and dedications, the usual vanity of the learned. But one envelope was sealed, unposted, and addressed with a single Greek letter, F. Inside, a short line from the Bacchae, "He who hides himself shall be found in the light." Beneath it, a photograph. A woman standing by the river, her expression the kind that invites both pity and curiosity. I asked Lewis to find out who she was. He said he would. I believed him, though I doubted he'd know where to start. There was something else, a note of absurd precision on Merriweather's calendar. Every Thursday, marked with a small dot of blue ink, the word evensong. I remembered the hymn from the night before, how it had echoed against the nave. Et lux perpetua luceat eis. Light is eternal. Perhaps Merriweather had sought it too literally. As we left, I caught sight of the college porter polishing the brass on the main gate. He nodded at me, the kind of nod that carries a story he isn't ready to tell. I asked casually whether he'd seen the doctor that night. He hesitated, then said that Merriweather had been cycling toward the bridge, humming, of all things, an opera tune. Verdi, perhaps. Something about destiny. Back at the car, Lewis asked if I thought it was suicide. I told him I hadn't thought of anything yet. But the river, I said, seldom gives up its secrets willingly. He looked puzzled, as though I'd been speaking Greek. I almost smiled. That night, unable to sleep, I poured myself another whiskey and stared at the crossword I'd taken from the desk. River's secret poet lies below. 6 letters. The solution came slowly, almost against my will or well. A river, a pseudonym, a poet of truth disguised. I folded the paper away, disturbed by the neatness of it. There are times when a clue arrives before the crime makes sense. This, I felt, was one of them. The scholar in blue had left behind something more intricate than despair, something that waited like the echo of a hymn to be understood. Dinner at St. Cuthbert's had always been a ceremony of pretense, a small theatre of civility performed beneath portraits of long-dead men. That evening, I took my place among them, a reluctant guest at the fellows' table, while the rain outside rearranged the college gardens into blurred reflections. The room smelt of wax and port and something faintly medicinal, the odor of learning too long enclosed. The bursar, a man whose waistcoat buttons waged an endless war against his appetite, introduced the gathering with a kind of gloomy pride. To my right sat Dr. Elspeth Ryder, poet and lecturer, her smile like a knife kept sharp by disappointment. She spoke softly, rarely meeting anyone's eyes. Across from her, Colin Fawkes, the young lecturer with too much hair and too little humility, fidgeted with his napkin as if expecting applause. At the head sat Reverend Mallinson, whose thin hands trembled as he poured claret, the gesture sanctified by repetition. I listened to the fragments of conversation that pass for honesty in Oxford, remarks about library budgets, lectures unattended, the college choir's alarming intonation of bird. Beneath it all, an undertow of tension, the kind that gathers when one chair at the table has suddenly become vacant. No one mentioned Merryweather directly. They spoke of him in absences. The missing quotation, the paper that might never be finished, the uneasy relief that his name no longer appeared on the rota. Lewis, seated further down, tried to look interested in the architecture. I envied him for his innocence. He still believed in rooms without subtext. I let my glass linger halfway to my lips, observing. Fawkes avoided Elspeth's gaze. The bursar kept refilling his glass too quickly. Mallinson's prayer before the meal had ended a syllable short, as though cut by conscience. When the soup arrived, tepid and apologetic, I asked whether Merryweather had seemed troubled lately. Fawkes muttered something about overwork. The bursar said academics often mistook tedium for tragedy. Elspeth, after a pause long enough to matter, said that he had lately begun revising an old essay on Greek irony, the one that had caused unpleasantness years ago. She added that he had spoken, the week before his death, of a letter he intended to send. To whom, she didn't know. I noticed then a faint ink smudge on her left thumb, the sort that comes not from writing but from handling carbon copies. It wasn't a deduction, merely an observation, though it hummed faintly in the mind. Dessert was a kind of custard, colorless and moral. Conversation drifted to the weather. The port circulated. Someone laughed too loudly at nothing. Oxford dinners are curious things, half confession, half alibi. By the time the candles shortened, the meal had become a requiem performed without belief. As we rose, Elspeth touched my sleeve. She said Merryweather had once claimed that irony was not a literary device, but a form of cowardice. She wondered aloud whether drowning might be the same. Before I could answer, she drifted away, leaving behind the faint scent of bergamot and something more brittle. Lewis joined me in the cloister afterwards. The air had cooled, carrying the sharp smell of stone after rain. He said it had been a long evening for little gain. I told him he was wrong, that people often confess by omission. He looked at me as though I were quoting riddles again. Through the window of the dining hall, I could still see the table, now empty except for a single overturned glass reflecting candlelight. The symmetry of it struck me. There was nothing theatrical in Merryweather's death, but its echoes were carefully arranged. As we walked toward the gate, Lewis asked whether I'd learnt anything useful. I said only that the living, like the dead, sometimes drown in silence, and that in Oxford, silence has a way of sounding almost like respect. It was Lewis who found the letter, though he'd have called it luck rather than observation. In my experience, luck seldom arrives without a small measure of guilt. The envelope was sealed, resting between 2 volumes of Aeschylus on Merryweather's bookshelf, an odd place for secrecy, since scholars rarely look for sin among their own virtues. The paper was of an old-fashioned kind, the watermark faintly visible when I held it to the window. A single Greek letter marked the front F, neither addressed nor signed. Inside, only a line of verse written in a slanted hand, "He who hides himself shall be found in the light." Beneath it, a photograph. A woman standing by the river, her coat buttoned to the neck, the faintest smile suggesting she knew more than she intended to say. The print had yellowed at the edges. Time has a talent for softening both guilt and memory. Lewis assumed it was sentimental, perhaps the remnant of an affair. He said as much while trying not to sound interested. I told him that academics rarely kill for love. They kill for ownership of an idea, yet even as I spoke, I wasn't sure I believed it. We took the letter to the light, and I noticed a second mark, a thumbprint, faint, blurred by moisture. The paper carried the ghost of perfume, something floral and restrained, like regret dressed for a college dinner. I asked Lewis to find out who developed photographs for St. Cuthbert's 20 years ago. He looked surprised. He still thinks the present tense holds all the answers. Later, I walked to the river myself. The path was narrow, lined with dripping willows, and the air tasted faintly of rust and wet stone. Students passed, their laughter rising and falling, like birds startled by rain. Near the bridge, I saw a small figure watching the water, a woman in a grey coat, her hair streaked with silver. She turned as I approached, her expression cautious, though not afraid. Dr. Elspeth Ryder. She said she'd come to think. About Merryweather, of course. They'd argued, she admitted, though she preferred the word disagreed. He'd accused her of plagiarism, or perhaps she'd accused him. I can't recall her exact phrasing, which was likely the point. She mentioned a lost locket once belonging to her mother, stolen years ago from the senior common room. It had been engraved with a single word in Greek force. Light. I asked whether she knew anything of the letter found in Merryweather's room. Her eyes flickered, a small betrayal quickly disguised as fatigue. She said she did not. That word light seemed to hover between us, unwelcome and familiar. Back in my flat, I placed the letter beside the crossword from the previous evening. The symmetry disturbed me. River's secret poet lies below. He who hides himself shall be found in the light. 2 clues, or perhaps 2 versions of the same one. Both spoke of concealment, revelation, and water, the elements Oxford thrives upon. I poured a whiskey and studied the photograph again. The woman's shoes were sinking slightly in the mud, the river blurred behind her. I imagined Merryweather taking the picture, perhaps in the days when affection still outweighed recrimination. The light in the photograph was peculiar, neither morning nor evening, a kind of suspended hour that belongs only to memory. It was then I noticed the chain around her neck, the locket oval, darkened by shadow, but unmistakably there. So it had not been stolen, at least not then. Elspeth had lied, though perhaps only to herself. Lewis returned the next day with a report from the college archives. The photo department had closed decades earlier, after a small scandal involving misappropriated funds. The records were incomplete, but one name recurred: Helena Ryder, lecturer in classics. Elspeth's mother, I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. The river outside my window shimmered faintly beneath the lamplight. Oxford has many faces, but at night it wears only one, that of a place quietly drowning in its own reflections. And somewhere among those reflections, I felt certain Merryweather was still trying to speak. I've always found that libraries tell the truth more readily than people do. The Bodleian, especially, with its silence dense as smoke and its smell of vellum and dusted neglect, can reveal more about human frailty than any confession room. That morning, the rain had turned Radcliffe Square into a mirror, and the sound of my shoes against the flagstones was the only company I had earned. Lewis waited outside, grateful for the excuse of paperwork. He had never liked libraries. Too many rules, too much restraint. I, on the other hand, find in their quiet an honesty the living rarely grants. Dr. Merryweather's last borrowed book had been logged only 2 days before his death. A slender, long-forgotten volume, Elegies and Epistles of an Unknown, published in 1929, withdrawn from the upper stack where few hands had trespassed in decades. I signed the Reader's Register, tracing my finger down the columns of neat calligraphy and abrupt pen strokes. The last entry before Merryweather's was dated 50 years earlier, belonging to one H. Wycliffe. The name clung to the page with peculiar gravity. Wycliffe, an old family perhaps, though the colleges tend to preserve ghosts longer than genealogies. I asked the librarian, a woman with eyes like worn marble, whether the name meant anything to her. She frowned, uncertain. Then, in the quiet way Oxford remembers its scandals, she said there had once been a lecturer of that name, or student, who had drowned in the Cherwell sometime in the 20s. A suicide, they said then, but people prefer their tragedies tidy. I thanked her, though she had already forgotten I'd asked. The register itself was beautiful, bound in blue calfskin, each signature a small defiance against oblivion. Merryweather's was smaller than I'd expected, tightly compressed, the handwriting of a man accustomed to precision but not generosity. I found the book in the rare manuscript's room. Its spine had split, the paper flaking like old skin. The verses were mediocre translations of minor Latin elegies, ornamented with prefaces about loss and light. Yet one passage had been underlined in pencil. He who returns to the river finds the same water, yet never the same reflection. Beside it faintly, the initials AM and a smudge as though someone had tried, too late, to erase the thought. The custodian looked up from her desk and said, Merryweather had requested the book for an article on Euripidean irony. I pretended to believe her. Academics rarely know why they read what they do, only that they must. Still, irony seemed a poor disguise for resurrection. In the margins of the final page, an annotation caught my attention. A fragment of Greek. Hastily translated, truth is not in the light, but in what casts it. I copied it down, not because I understood it, but because it had the weight of something meant to survive. When I returned to the register, I examined Wycliffe's entry again. The penmanship was elegant, patient, almost feminine. The date, March 3rd, 1929. I remembered what Elspeth Rider had said, that her mother's locket bore a Greek word meaning light. It was coincidence, perhaps, but Oxford thrives on the coincidence of shadows. Outside, the afternoon had begun to dull. The quadrangle lay hushed beneath a sheet of mist. A group of undergraduates hurried past, their laughter scattering against the stone. I envied them for the arrogance of forgetting. At the gate, I paused. A small plaque dedicated to the drowned student had weathered into illegibility, save for one line that still resisted erosion, lux perpetua luceat is. The same phrase is sung at evensong, the same phrase Merryweather had underlined years later in his own lecture notes. When I rejoined Lewis, he asked what I'd found. I told him only a name, half erased, that had waited 50 years to be read again. He said that didn't sound much like progress. I said it never does until one notices who wrote it last. As we walked toward the car, I thought again of the river and its cruel fidelity, always the same path, always new water. Somewhere between those two truths, I suspected, lay Merryweather's final secret, and perhaps my own. It was late afternoon when I went back to the river. The air carried that faint, metallic scent peculiar to Oxford after rain, half silt, half memory. The chair-well moved slowly, burdened with fragments of leaves and reflection. The towpath was deserted, save for a solitary woman seated on a bench beneath a leaning willow. She seemed to belong there, as though the landscape had been waiting patiently for her return. Mrs. Wycliffe. I had found her through an old directory and a retired porter who still believed that kindness ought to outweigh discretion. Her cottage lay just beyond the city, near Jericho, where the streets narrow and the air turns domestic. She'd agreed to meet me, though her voice on the telephone had been the sort one associates with good breeding and tiredness, not reluctance exactly, but resignation that no conversation ever ends the way one hopes. She was older than I'd imagined, her eyes pale as smoke, her posture deliberate, as though rehearsed for a portrait. She greeted me without surprise. "You've come about Alan," she said. I nodded. The river murmured in reply. She spoke of her brother, First Henry, the drowned student from St. Cuthbert's, the name that had haunted the library register. She said he'd been brilliant, careless, devoted to poetry, and to a certain tutor whose reputation never recovered. I asked whether she recalled the tutor's name. She hesitated. Then, quietly, Merryweather. The syllables fell with the weight of something rehearsed too long. She said the college had buried it all, the scandal, the whisper of plagiarism, the suggestion that Henry had taken his life after being betrayed by the man he adored. Oxford had called it suicide, though she called it vanity, an act meant to wound the living. I asked what had become of Merryweather after that. She said he had stayed on, cloaked in piety and tenure, writing papers on irony as though the word absolved him. I looked at her delicate, steady, unadorned hands. She wore no ring. She must have noticed because she smiled faintly. Henry wasn't the only one he deceived, she said. I was 19. There was a dance at Randolph. I believed him when he said he envied my brother's youth. I thought it meant tenderness. The light had shifted. The river now held a thin sheen of gold, turning the surface into a mirror that refused clarity. I asked why she had agreed to meet me after all these years. She said because Alan had written to her last winter an apology disguised as scholarship. He had sent her a copy of Elegies and Epistles of an Unknown, with the inscription, "For what should have been forgiven." She had read it twice, then burned it. Lewis arrived halfway through our conversation, carrying the awkward energy of a man who knows he's intruding on something he doesn't fully understand. I introduced him, and she barely acknowledged it. She asked if Merryweather's death had been deliberate. I said I didn't know. It wasn't entirely true. She looked out toward the current and said that drowning often begins long before the water. There was a pause, then, one of those moments that refuses to end because it knows too much. The willow branches dipped into the current like hesitant fingers. Before we left, she handed me a small envelope. Inside was a faded newspaper clipping dated 1929, student's death at St. Cuthbert's Bridge. In the margin, a note in her hand, "He wore blue." The same phrase had appeared in Merryweather's lecture notes, underlined twice. Coincidence, perhaps. But coincidence in Oxford has a way of feeling deliberate. Lewis said on the walk back that the woman seemed brittle. I told him she had spent her life living in the echo of a sentence never completed. He didn't understand, and I didn't blame him. At home that night, I placed the clipping beside Merryweather's photograph of the woman by the river, the same poise, only time altering the light. The resemblance was faint but certain. I found myself wondering if she had ever stood again in the same place after her brother's death, or whether the river had summoned her there unconsciously. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the faint sound of the cathedral bells. I thought of Merryweather's blue tie, of Henry Wycliffe's blue scarf, and of the line he had once underlined in the borrowed book. He who returns to the river finds the same water, yet never the same reflection. Perhaps that was all Oxford ever offered, reflections mistaken for truth, and men too clever to see the difference. It was raining when Fawkes confessed not the kind of rain that cleanses, but the sort that lingers indecisively, as though unwilling to commit to honesty. He sat across from me in the small, airless office at St. Cuthbert's. The window fogged, the air steeped in the faint odor of chalk and tobacco. He had the expression of a man eager to be misunderstood. He began without prompting. Said he'd forged some of Merryweather's notes, taken ideas from the late scholar's drafts, and intended to pass them off as his own. I listened, not because I believed him, but because guilt has a rhythm one learns to recognize a music of its own. He was too measured, too convenient. The words fit too neatly, like a crossword filled in after glancing at the solution. He spoke of the evening of Merryweather's death as though he were reading it from a script. Said he'd gone to the rooms at midnight, returned the borrowed proofs, argued, then left Merryweather at his desk, despondent. A few hours later, the body was found. The story closed upon itself with an elegance I distrusted. Lewis watched from the corner, his pen moving dutifully across the page. I envied him that faith in record-keeping, as though the act of writing could make truth permanent. I asked Fawkes why he was confessing now. He said conscience. The word landed poorly, too light for the burden it pretended to carry. He looked at his hands then, noticing for the first time the ink stains on his fingers, the half-moons of exhaustion beneath his eyes. I told him conscience rarely waits for an audience. He smiled faintly and said he had read somewhere that remorse, like poetry, demanded timing. When he left, Lewis said he seemed genuine enough. I told him so did most actors before the curtain fell. After he'd gone, I sat alone with Merryweather's files. The rain pressed harder against the glass, its persistence almost sympathetic. I found myself studying the scholar's handwriting, a habit of small serifs at the end of words, the precision of someone who mistrusts spontaneity. There was one letter, however, written in haste, its edges uneven. I recognized the difference before I understood it. It was not Merryweather's hand. It was Fawkes's, the same small hesitation before the letter T, the same narrow spacing. The forgery existed, yes, but not the crime he confessed. In the margin of that letter, a phrase in Greek phos anthropou, light of man, repeated twice, the ink heavier on the second. I traced it absently with my thumb, thinking of the drowned man's wristwatch. Still missing. A gift, Elspeth had said, engraved with the word light. The next morning, I found her in the cloister. She stood by the ivy wall, the pale sun making her hair appear almost colorless. She asked whether I'd arrested Fawkes. I told her not yet. She said then, quite calmly, that Allen had once described truth as a form of cruelty. I said that most scholars confuse cruelty with clarity. She smiled at the smile of someone who's seen clarity ruin better people. Before she walked away, she added that Fawkes was too proud to kill and too vain to atone. I asked how she knew. She didn't answer, but her silence was eloquent enough to be a kind of citation. That evening, I returned to the river. The wind had picked up the water's surface and broke into restless geometries. I stood on the bridge, thinking of Merryweather's careful life collapsing into such careless death. There was something indecently symmetrical about it all. The old drowning and the new. The woman who remembered and the student who forgot. Oxford, I thought, never punishes sin, merely archives it. At home, I opened my crossword, seeking distraction in the order of clues. One asked a word for repentance, 7 letters. The answer, I realized, was fiction. I closed the paper. Fawkes's confession had been polished, plausible, and empty of a man's attempt to turn guilt into performance. But performance, I've learned, is often the only truth people can bear to tell. The solicitor's office stood at the corner of Holywell and Longwall, a narrow Georgian building whose windows seemed to have been fitted to exclude both light and warmth. Inside, the air was thick with the perfume of old paper and the faint, medicinal smell of ink. Mr. Fielding, the college's legal representative, was a man who spoke as if punctuation had to be earned. He offered sherry, which I declined, and a chair, which I accepted. He began with professional reluctance. Dr. Merriweather's last testament, drawn up only a fortnight before his death, left the bulk of his estate to the college library, a modest sum to a domestic in Headington, and one peculiar bequest that had perplexed even Fielding's efficient mind. A sum of £5,000, not small, not generous to a person unnamed, described only as the daughter of Helena Wycliffe, for the truth owed. I asked if he knew the name. He did not, nor had he attempted to find her. Lawyers, I've discovered, prefer mysteries to remain unbilled. He showed me the handwritten codicil, a single paragraph added in Merriweather's own hand. It was neat, controlled, yet with one correction that had been violently crossed out, the sort of stroke one makes to silence doubt. Beneath the signature lay a verse, written as though an afterthought: "The child of light inherits silence." Fielding assumed it was poetry. I knew it was a confession. Lewis, who had insisted on coming despite his dislike of legal men, said it sounded biblical. I said it sounded Greek. Outside, the air was brittle with sunlight. We walked toward the Sheldonian, our footsteps echoing against the stones like unfinished thoughts. I told Lewis to find out if Helena Wycliffe had ever been on the staff of St. Cuthbert's. He asked why it mattered. I said because dead men rarely rewrite their wills for strangers. That afternoon I returned to Merriweather's rooms. They had been cleared, though not convincingly. Dust has a way of preserving guilt more faithfully than memory. On the desk lay a thin folder labeled Elegy in Blue Elspeth Ryder's latest collection. I leafed through it, expecting affection, and found restraint instead. The poems were precise, cold, and somehow remorseful. One verse caught me: "The river keeps what conscience cannot." I felt then, with a certainty I couldn't justify, that she had written it for him. At the bottom of the folder, folded twice, was a typed draft of Merriweather's lecture notes. In the margin, written faintly in a pencil, a phrase truth owed, light inherited, the same words that appeared in his will, rearranged. He had been revising not just his scholarship, but his life. It was nearly dusk when I reached Elspeth's cottage near the Banbury Road. She opened the door as though expecting me. The room was austere, a single lamp, a vase of dead lilies, a piano whose keys had not been touched for months. She offered tea but poured whiskey for herself. I told her about the will, the daughter of Helena Wycliffe, the money left for the truth owed. Her hands, resting on the rim of the glass, did not tremble. She said her mother had once worked at St. Cuthbert's, a lecturer in classics, and that Merriweather had been her mentor. She spoke of him carefully, as if each word might alter history. I asked whether her mother had ever mentioned a child other than her. She smiled then, thinly, like a curtain lifting in an empty theatre. She said her mother had spoken once of a lost inheritance, not of money but of recognition. A paper co-authored, then buried. A promise broken. She asked if that counted as truth. I told her it did, though not the kind that can be written into wills. When I left, the rain had returned. Oxford shimmered beneath its usual disguise of repentance. I stood beneath the eaves of the chapel, watching the water collect in the gutters. In my hand was the copy of Elegy in Blue she had pressed upon me. On the title page, she had written in her small, unhurried hand, "For what remains beneath the surface." Later in my flat, I placed the book beside the letter with the Greek verse and the photograph of the woman by the river. The resemblance between Helena and Elspeth was no longer undeniable. It was hereditary. I looked again at Merryweather's line. The child of light inherits silence, and realized it was not written in repentance, but recognition. The clock struck midnight. Somewhere across the city, the bells of Magdalen answered. I poured another whiskey and listened to the rain, thinking how Oxford had perfected the art of inheritance, of guilt, of silence, of unfinished lines passed neatly from one scholar to the next. There are mornings in Oxford that arrive without expectation, grey without ceremony, and yet heavy with something unspoken. That morning, the mist over the Cherwell lay low and stubborn, as if the river itself refused to forget. Lewis had already gone ahead, his boots leaving faint, uncertain imprints on the towpath. The police tape hung limp, flapping gently in the damp air, like a flag marking an unfinished war. I walked slowly, unwilling to disturb the silence. The river was swollen, its surface dull as tarnished pewter, and then I saw it, half hidden among the reeds, a glint of metal catching the reluctant light. A constable waded in, muttering under his breath, and brought it to me in his gloved hand. The wristwatch, rusted now, but unmistakable. The blue face dulled, the glass fractured like a frozen tear. I turned it over carefully. On the back, an inscription, "Let the light find you." Lewis said it must have come loose when the body went under. I didn't answer. The clasp was still intact. It hadn't come loose at all. Someone had removed it, and that someone had placed it here deliberately, as though returning an offering to the river that had already taken too much. I stood at the edge, watching the water move. The reeds whispered in the soft wind. The inscription troubled me not for its sentiment, but for its timing. The watch had stopped at precisely 6:15. Evensong. The same hour Merryweather attended each Thursday without fail. The same hour I suspected that he had died. There was something indecently symmetrical about its death choreographed to ritual. I remembered Elspeth's remark, the way she'd said that drowning might be another form of irony. I had dismissed it then. I shouldn't have. We followed the curve of the river until it reached the small wooden bridge. The boards were slick, the rails splintered in one place where something or someone had struck it hard. I knelt, running a finger along the damaged wood. Beneath the layer of moss, faint traces of blue paint. From a bicycle frame, perhaps. Merryweather's bicycle had never been found. Lewis said he'd check downstream. I told him not to bother. The river keeps what it wants and gives back only what it finds convenient. Back in my office, the watch sat on the desk beside my crossword. I couldn't help myself. I wound it gently, though the mechanism was long dead. Its hands remained still, pointing always toward Evensong. I imagined him standing by this very river, tie drawn tight, the air heavy with resignation. Yet there had been no struggle, no footprints other than his own. Death had approached him as an old acquaintance. The sound of the typewriter startled me, Lewis returning from the records room. He'd found the church register. Merryweather's attendance was marked every Thursday without fail for nearly 20 years. Except the week before his death. A gap, clean and unremarked, between two dates. I stared at the empty line. It was then that the deduction, quiet and almost reluctant, began to form. The absence was the clue. Someone else had attended in his place, someone who knew his habits well enough to mimic them. To the world, the scholar was still at prayer, but at 6:15 he had already met the river. That evening I went again to St. Cuthbert's. The chapel lights were dimmed, and the choir rehearsed softly in the nave. I stood at the back, unseen, letting the music fill the gaps thought had left behind. The same hymn as before, O Nata Lux. The same voices ascending, fragile and infinite. I closed my eyes. The melody seemed to echo through every corridor of the case. The blue tie, The inscription, the photograph by the river, the locket engraved with furs. Light, everything, always, return to light. And yet light, I realized, reveals only what has not already chosen to hide. When the final chord faded, I opened my eyes to find Elspeth standing near the aisle, her face unreadable. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There are confessions that exist entirely in the pause between two breaths. Later, walking home through the drizzle, I thought of the river once more, how it takes its shape from the land, but obeys none of its rules. Perhaps Merryweather had understood that better than any of us. Perhaps that was his final irony, that truth, like water, is clearest only when it has stopped moving. It was evening when I returned to St. Cuthbert's for the last time. The college had folded itself into shadow, the quadrangle wet with the kind of rain that blurs distinctions between stone and sky, memory and regret. The chapel lamps glowed faintly through the mist, their light too thin to be consoling. I remember thinking that Oxford always looked most honest in the half-light, when truth had no choice but to share its seat with ambiguity. Elspeth was there, waiting. She stood beside the chapel door, bareheaded in the drizzle, her face calm but drained of defiance. The air between us seemed filled with the sort of silence one associates with the end of something, a performance, perhaps, or a prayer. I told her about the watch, the engraving, the time it had stopped. She nodded once as though she had always known it would be found. There was no denial, no plea for mercy, only the weary certainty of someone who has carried her guilt too long to set it down now. She said Alan had come to her that night, not to accuse but to mock. He'd found the draft of her latest poem, one that spoke too plainly of her mother and the past. He had called it plagiarism, a family inheritance. She had called it theft. She said she only meant to frighten him. When she pushed him near the bridge, the rain had already begun, and the river was higher than either of them realized. He had slipped without sound, the way scholars do when their words abandon them. She said she had stood there for a long time, watching the water close over him, waiting for something, a hand, perhaps, or a sign of reprieve. But the river, faithful as ever, had kept its own counsel. I asked her why she had gone back the next morning. Why did she place the watch among the reeds? She looked up toward the chapel window, where a single candle still flickered. She said she wanted him to be found by light. Lewis waited at the gate. He had that look of uneasy compassion that honest men wear when the world turns out crueler than they were led to believe. I told him to fetch the chief superintendent, though not immediately. He asked whether she'd be charged. I said the law would find its way to her soon enough. It always does, though seldom by the route it imagines. When he left, I went into the chapel. The choir was rehearsing again for Bird, this time, the Ave Verum. The notes drifted upward like small stubborn hopes, dissolving into the vaulting. I sat near the back, alone, and listened. The hymn felt both sacred and human, a confession disguised as beauty. I thought then of Merryweather, the blue tie, the missing bicycle, the letter marked with a single Greek letter. I thought of Helena Wycliffe and the lost locket, of a daughter who had inherited not her mother's beauty but her grief, and I thought of myself, standing among them all like an uninvited witness at a funeral where every mourner believed himself innocent. When the music stopped, I walked to the lectern. There was a single book open upon it, the same elegies and epistles Merryweather had borrowed from the Bodleian. Its pages were thin as skin. I turned to the underlined passage, the one about the river and reflection. Beside it, in faint pencil, another line had been added, "Forgive the echo, it never meant to return." Outside, the rain had eased. The courtyard shimmered, washed clean of its illusions. I could hear Lewis's car idling somewhere beyond the gate, the hum of duty waiting to reclaim the night. Elspeth was still by the chapel steps, her coat darkened with rain, her expression almost serene. She said she'd wait there until they came. I told her that waiting was its own punishment. She said she knew, that her mother had waited too, for a truth that never arrived. Then she turned her face toward the lighted window, and I left her there a figure carved from stillness, framed by the trembling glow of the lamp above the door. Back in my flat, I poured the last of the whiskey and opened the crossword. The clue read, "What remains when knowledge fails?" 7 letters. The answer came quickly in silence. I set the paper aside. The night beyond the window was full of sound, the rain soft against the panes, a distant clock striking 9, the faint hum of life continuing in spite of everything. I thought of Merriweather, of Elspeth, of all those who had sought redemption in learning and found only reflection. And for once, I didn't try to understand. Some truths, I've learned, are like the river visible only in motion, and gone the moment you reach for them.